The cell door hissed shut behind Commander Sarah Chen, and the magnetic locks engaged with a finality that echoed through the sterile corridors of Station Zephyr 7. The Krellian Empire had built this prison to house the galaxy's most dangerous criminals, its walls lined with neural dampeners designed to suppress even the strongest psychic abilities. But Sarah Chen wasn't psychic. She was something far more terrifying to her captors. She was human. Warden Vextai observed the prisoner through the one-way viewport, his mandibles clicking in what passed for satisfaction among his species. The human sat motionless on the metal bench, her uniform torn and bloodied from the battle that had led to her capture. Her ship, the UES Defiance, had held off an entire Krellian fleet for 6 hours before being overwhelmed. Intelligence reports indicated she was a key figure in the Terran resistance. "Begin Phase 1, Vextai commanded his subordinates. The torture protocols developed by the Krellian Empire had broken representatives of 47 different species. Humans would be no different. The first week involved sleep deprivation. Krellians required only 2 hours of rest per cycle, so they assumed other species shared similar limitations. They kept the lights blazing and played discordant sounds at random intervals. Sarah simply adapted, learning to micro-sleep during the brief moments of relative quiet. When questioned, she would only provide her name, rank, and service number, delivered with the kind of steady calm that made her interrogators increasingly uncomfortable. The second week brought temperature manipulation. The cell alternated between freezing and sweltering conditions every few hours. The Krellians watched through their sensors as Sarah's body temperature fluctuated, expecting her to break. Instead, she began doing exercises during the cold periods to generate heat, and remained perfectly still during the hot ones to conserve energy. She hummed old Terran songs to herself, melodies that somehow seemed to make the guards nervous when they heard them through the audio feeds. Dr. Zithkar, the prison's chief interrogator, was brought in for Phase 3. The Krellian's forearms gestured dismissively at the unchanged prisoner. "Increase the neural pressure," he ordered. "These mammals have primitive brains. Overstimulate them and they'll crack like eggshells." They bombarded Sarah's mind with psychic static, waves of mental noise designed to cause disorientation and panic. Most species would be reduced to gibbering wrecks within hours. Sarah closed her eyes, steadied her breathing, and began reciting the periodic table of elements. When she finished, she moved on to the digits of pi that she'd memorized in school. The human brain, it seemed, had developed fascinating defense mechanisms during its evolution on a death world. By the 4th week, Vextai was receiving increasingly worried reports from his staff. The human hadn't just endured their methods, she was actively analyzing them. She had begun counting the shifts of the guards, mapping their routines, and somehow discerning the layout of sections of the station she'd never seen. When they tried sensory isolation, she created mental exercises to keep her mind sharp. When they tried sensory overload, she found patterns in the chaos and used them to meditate. "Perhaps," suggested Dr. Zithkar nervously, "we should try a different approach. Chemical interrogation, perhaps." The Krellian truth serums were administered in carefully calculated doses. They watched in amazement as Sarah's metabolism processed the compounds in ways their models couldn't predict. She began speaking, but not in the way they expected. Instead, she told them stories, tales of human history, of wars and struggles, of people who had endured far worse than anything the Krellians could devise. She spoke of POWs who had spent years in bamboo cages, of concentration camp survivors who had found strength and hope, of explorers who had crossed frozen wastelands with nothing but determination. With each story, something strange happened to her captors. The guards began to linger outside her cell, drawn by her voice. Even through the translator, there was something in her tone that spoke to something deeper than language. Dr. Zithkar found himself unable to sleep, haunted by the human's words. She had described a species that viewed suffering not as defeat, but as a test to be overcome, a species that had turned their own planet's attempts to kill them into the very source of their strength. The breaking point came during the 5th week. Vextai, desperate and under pressure from his superiors, authorized the use of empathic torture, a device that would force Sarah to experience the death agonies of every enemy soldier killed by human forces during the war. It was considered the most cruel punishment in the galaxy, reserved only for the most heinous criminals. They activated the device and waited for the screaming to begin. Instead, Sarah Chen stood up, walked to the center of her cell, and began to cry. Not from pain, but from a profound sadness, that seemed to fill the entire station through the monitoring systems. She wept for every life lost, human and alien alike, and spoke their names when she knew them. She mourned for the families they'd left behind, for dreams that would never be fulfilled, for the waste of it all. The empathic feedback loop, designed to amplify suffering, instead began transmitting Sarah's genuine grief and compassion to every sensitive individual within range. Krellian guards found themselves weeping for enemies they'd killed in battle. Dr. Zithkar collapsed, overwhelmed by an emotional complexity his species had never developed. Even Warden Vextai felt something crack inside his chitinous chest. Not his resolve, but his certainty that humans were just another species to be broken. On the 36th day of her imprisonment, Sarah Chen was visited by a delegation of Krellian officials. They found her sitting calmly, having braided her hair with threads pulled from her uniform, humming a lullaby her grandmother had taught her. We wish to discuss terms," Vextai said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked up with eyes that held no hatred, no triumph, only a tired sort of understanding. "I've been waiting for you to realize that some things can't be broken," she said. "They can only be shared." The Krellian Empire released Commander Sarah Chen 3 days later as part of a prisoner exchange that marked the beginning of peace negotiations. The guards who had tortured her stood in silent formation as she walked to the transport ship, and many of them wept openly, not from shame, but from a strange new emotion they couldn't quite name. As her ship departed, Sarah pressed her hand against the viewport and nodded once to the station. Inside her cell, she had left a small origami crane folded from a scrap of her uniform, and carved into the metal wall were the words, "We are all prisoners of something. The key is choosing what we do with the bars." Humanity had not been broken by the galaxy's cruelest prison. Instead, they had done something far more dangerous. They had taught their captors how to hope.